Good evening, and welcome to the virtual JCC of Metropolitan Detroit. My name is Leslie Black, and I'm one of the chairs of the SAGE Committee. Today's program, Releasing Roots, Hebrew Poetry and Translation, is a co-production of SAGE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. SAGE is endowed by a generous gift from Sis Maisel and is supported by Carol and Ronald Fogel through the JCC's Pillars of Light program. The Frankel Center is a longtime partner of SAGE and the JCC, and we are thrilled to be working with them once again. If you enjoy this event and our other virtual programs, please consider donating to the cultural arts or becoming a patron of one of our festivals. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org. While you're here at our YouTube channel, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the reminder bell so that you'll always stay up to date on all of our exciting virtual events. We have a really wonderful event for you tonight, and we want you to be a part of it. If you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the YouTube comment box below or text them to the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers will take as many questions as they can. We are sorry that Professor Veidlinger wasn't able to be with us this evening due to a family emergency, but we are so lucky to have Professor Maya Barzilai from U of M to moderate for us. Maya Barzilai is an associate professor of Hebrew and Jewish culture at the University of Michigan. This year, she serves as co-head fellow of the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, devoted to the theme of translating Jewish cultures. Her 2016 book, Golem, Modern Wars and Their Monsters, received the AJS Jordan Schnitzer Book Prize, and she has recently published Golem, How He Came into the World, a study of the famous 1920 Golem film. Her current book project concerns German, Hebrew, modern translations in a Zionist context. Please join me now in welcoming Maya Barzilai.
Thank you, Leslie, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be back here. And I'm really looking forward to my discussion with Professor Adriana Jacobs tonight. And Leslie mentioned that I'm co-head fellow of the Frankel Institute this year, and the other head fellow is Adriana Jacobs. So I'd like to first say a few words about Adriana and then bring her on to read from her wonderful translations. Adriana Jacobs is an associate professor of modern Hebrew literature at Oxford University. She's author of this book, which is a wonderful study of Hebrew poetry and translation that bears the title Strange Cocktail, Translation and the Making of Modern Hebrew Literature. And it came out in 2018 with the University of Michigan Press here in Ann Arbor. And I hope she'll tell us more about that title, Strange Cocktail, and what it has to do with translation. She's also a really prolific translator who's published her Hebrew poetry translations in journals such as World Literature Today, North American Review, and the Ilanot Review, among others, as well as in the collection Women's Hebrew Poetry on American Shores, poems by Anne Kleiman and Annabelle Fermelant, which came out in 2016. And in 2015, Jacobs was awarded a Penheim Translation Fund grant for her translation of Vaan Nguyen's The Truffle Eye, which is forthcoming. And she'll also be reading to us from this very unique poet's oeuvre. As I mentioned, this year she's at our own Frankel Institute, and we're really happy that she's joined us this evening.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing? Long time no see.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, so I gave all of your credentials, and
Yes,
they're wonderful. And I didn't even mention all of the articles you have published on translation. I've been a fan of your work for years, and I just preparing for this event, I recalled how already in 2018, when I was thinking of devoting a year to translation studies, in particular in the Jewish context, you were the first person that occurred to me. And I contacted you, and you immediately said, yes, I want to do this. Yeah. So after giving that opening, I want to ask you a more personal question. Kind of, how did you come to study Hebrew and become interested in translating from Hebrew into English? How did that all come about?
So, yeah, it is a really personal story. And I think for me, it starts with growing up bilingual. My mother's from Ecuador. And Spanish was actually my first language until the age of 5. And growing up, I grew up in a bilingual home. I spoke to my father in English. I spoke to my mother in Spanish. They would talk to each other in their respective languages across the dinner table. And so it felt very natural. And then in high school, I started reading poetry. I fell in love with the American poets that I was reading. And that sparked my curiosity for Ecuadorian poetry. So I started reading that, and in order to share it with my friends, I had to translate it into English, and that was my first foray into literary translation. And I continued that in college. I was really interested in translating poetry and studying poetry, but most of it was in Latin American literature. So I actually didn't start studying Hebrew until my senior year of college. And there's a whole long story about how I encountered Hebrew during my year abroad in Santiago de Chile. I met some Israelis. I heard Hebrew spoken for the first time in my life. And I was completely dazzled by this language that I was hearing. And when I got back to complete my studies at the College of William and Mary, I had maxed out all my credits for my comp-lit degree. And so I decided that I had room to study a new language. And I decided I was going to study Hebrew. And so it was all very impulsive at the time. Little did I know that that was going to turn into a lifelong love affair with the language and result in a PhD in Hebrew and devoting my life to it. But actually, if Jamie can start this slide, what I wanted to do is actually share with you one of my first translations of a Hebrew poem. So there it is. So when my senior year of college, I studied the Hebrew that was available was a biblical Hebrew course that was taught by a scholar named Nama Zahavi-Ili, who is now a very dear friend of mine. And she was an incredibly generous teacher. And she would meet with me every week. And I would bring my translations of the poet Rachel, whose work I had actually started reading in Spanish translation. And I decided this would be a good way to start working on my Hebrew, combining the things that I loved, which is poetry and translation. So actually, I found this is probably one of the only translations that survived from my college years. Most of those documents were purged at some point. But I found this cleaning some papers. You can see on the left, I had typed out the Hebrew and I wrote in the nikud very carefully by hand. And then I haven't changed the translation, so I'm just going to read it out to you. This is a poem by the poet Rachel Bluestein, who was active in the early 20th century. It's a poem titled Mineged. The heart is inclined, the ear attentive. Is he coming? Will he come? In all hope, there is the pain of Nevo. This one facing the other, the two shores of one torrent, the cliff of separation, distant forever. To open the palms, to see from across, there no one comes, a man and his Nevo over a great earth. So this kind of poem, yeah.
That's impressive for a first translation.
Well, I had help from my teacher. I mean, we really went through every word and, she would unpack, some of the biblical resonances for me. But I think this sort of work really spoke to me at the time, because I felt like I was doing something almost that felt to me at the moment really impossible. I was like, I'm I had just turned 21. I was starting a new language. I really didn't know where it was going to take me, but I knew I wanted to keep going. So I felt a bit like Hebrew maybe was my niveau, and I wasn't sure if I was going to get there. But then I ended up going to Israel and studying Hebrew intensively for a few years, and eventually came back to the States to do a PhD in comparative literature, and wrote my dissertation on what eventually became Strange Cocktail. So if we can go to the next slide, you can see Strange Cocktail, Translation and Making of Modern Hebrew Poetry. And I know Maya, you and I will talk a little more about this book, but the book, again, I've always been interested in poetry and translation. And in this study, I was really looking at asking myself the question, like, why do poets translate? What motivates a poet to translate the work of another poet? And especially, for me, Hebrew poetry offered a lot of rich case studies for that relation. I felt a lot of the poets I was looking at, like Leah Goldberg and Esther Rab, and later the poets Avot Yeshurun and Harold Schimmel, had all incorporated translation into their own writing. And actually, during those years, I wasn't doing any literary translation. After my Rachel translations, I was really focused on studying Hebrew, then doing research for the dissertation. And I wasn't really focused at all on literary translation. But like a lot of scholars who work on Hebrew literature but write in English, I found myself doing a lot of translating for the book. And that sort of got me interested in this again. And almost, I think at some point, just for fun, I thought, I need to be doing something that's not my dissertation. So I was reading some contemporary Hebrew poetry online. And that's when, if we go to the next slide, I came across the work of this poet, Vaan Nguyen, or Vaan Nguyen, as she's called in Hebrew. Her chapbook, The Truffle Eye, Ein HaKimihin, had just come out. And I read it, and I thought it was dazzling. And sort of kind of like my experience when I was younger, sharing poems in Spanish to my English-speaking friends, I thought, oh, this work is really so exciting. I'm going to translate some of it. And I just thought maybe, I could try to get these poems published. And so it really was kind of a side project for a while, just finding poems that I found really interesting in Hebrew, mostly contemporary poetry, and wanting to share it with people. I also felt like contemporary Hebrew poetry wasn't really widely represented in the sort of broad field of poetry and translation. And it just seemed like it would be a good project that could occasionally pull me away from the dissertation, which was sometimes all-consuming. So some people, maybe they pick up other hobbies to get away from their dissertations, but for me, it was translating poems. So I want to share I want to read a couple of Vaan Nguyen's poems. As you can see, now it's a proper book, which is coming out hopefully by next month through Zephyr Press. But this is the opening poem from her collection, which is probably also one of the more popular poems. And I put the Hebrew on the left, but for the interest of time, I'll read the translation. I'll read a little Hebrew later on, but these are longer poems. So this is Mekong River. Tonight I moved between three beds like I was sailing on the Mekong, and whispered the beauty of the Tigris and Euphrates. Under an endless moment, looking below the left tit, I have a hole, and you fill it with other men. Notes of tiger beer on your body. Next slide. The poem continues on the, there we go. Alone, crickets drone south of Laos. Showers of cold air from Hanoi, the back gasps, the tight ass, an ink stain on the belly. Sketch me a monochrome flowchart on fresh potted flowers. I'll release roots at your feet. I want to come to puke specks of dust in my crotch. Rest your hand in my pants. Make it personal. Who dares abandon a disease mid-sea? So to say the least, the poets I was writing about in Strange Cocktail were not using words like puke or crotch or referencing beer. And so this was really, I think it gave me a lot of pleasure to sort of translate these sort of poems that were so different from the poems that I was spending the rest of my day dissecting and writing about for the dissertation and later for the book. But Vaan Nguyen is also, for me, I found myself really drawn to her work and also to her life story. She's the daughter of Vietnamese refugees. And so I think for me also, a lot of the poets that I was translating, I have to say, I kind of identified with the way they were positioned in almost like, I think the way they wrestled with their kind of status vis-a-vis Hebrew, vis-a-vis Israeli culture. I think sometimes I felt like a little bit of an outsider. And I think sometimes translating poets like Vaan or some of the other poets that I've translated, it made me feel like a sort of kinship with writers who've wrestled with their relationship to Hebrew and Israeli culture in different ways. So that was one of the poems. I'll read one more from that collection. So this is a poem titled Culture Stain, Ketem Tabut. Examine before you extract the seeds of nothing at the riverbank, with the village air and the roads and so on. In the horizon, the city begins, a portable wax poet without a patron or fanzine. A rosy sun sets on a musical Monet Bach lake in your eyes. When we hold each other, you'll ask where I came from. I'll say, I came from this rot. Where did I come from, you're asking? I mean, parents? So this poem, for me, this was a very personal poem. I think growing up in a bicultural, bilingual home, a lot of times I would, I have, my name is Adriana, my middle name is Jimena. I would have these Spanish sounding names, but people would look at me and they'd be like, you don't look Ecuadorian, or, so I was always sort of dealing with these questions about like where I'm from, and they were always quite fraught. And then, of course, I read a poem like this, and I thought, oh, I know these sort of sentences when people are asking, where do you come from? Where do your parents come from? So I was really, again, another reason that I was drawn to Vaan Nguyen's work is that it raises sort of questions that I think I've tackled in my own life. And so in that sense, again, a very personal project. I think also translation of poetry has been an opportunity to inhabit the language of a poet and to learn from that language. So for example, the next poem I wanted to share is from a poet. Her name is Anna Herman. So there you have a little bit of the Hebrew, and I'll read a few lines from the Hebrew because it's quite a unique poem. So Anna Herman is a poet who she's published a few books. She's affiliated with a journal called Ho, and a lot of her writing, I think we would call her sort of a neo-formalist. It's very rhymed and metered, but in an incredibly sophisticated way. And I think also for me, translating her work was also taking on that challenge, like how to incorporate rhyme and meter in the translations. So this poem, I'll just read a few lines in Hebrew so you can see kind of the particular challenge of this poem, and then I'll read my English translation. This is called אמרתי שיורד לי דם, ואת אמרת, יורד לי דם מכל חוריי, ואת אמרת, אמרתי שמותי קרב, ואת אמרת, שמעתי צעקות עורב, ואת אמרת, So, and then I will read my translation. Here we go. So now you can hear the whole thing. So this is But doctor doesn't rhyme with anything, only doctor with doctor. That's a line from a poem by Dan Pagis. I said, I am really bleeding, and you said, Every orifice is seeping, and you said, I said, my death is nearing, and you said, I heard a raven shrieking, and you said, I said, in a bit, I'll be dead, and you said, My mind is hanging by a thread, and you said, Misery consumed me, and you said, Death hums like a flea, And when you said, it came back and drained me. And you said, But doesn't rhyme with a single thing. The waters come unto my soul and neck, but doesn't rhyme with anything. Only with I told you it's my birthday, and you had nothing to say, but you didn't give me pills or electric shock, and that's also a good thing. So, so that was a lot of fun, translating that kind of poem. I've done other poems by Anna Herman, and it's always the pleasure of trying to kind of recreate some kind of clever rhyme and meter in the English. And then finally, another poet that I started translating, and this is an example of a poet, as you know, Maya, who I started off saying, this is for fun, I'm not going to do anything academic with it. But the years go by and I can't help myself, and now I'm building a whole project around the poetry of Hezy Leskly, who's a wonderful poet. He died in 1994, I think 92, 94, of AIDS-related complications. He was an openly gay writer at a time when I think it was not very common in Israel for people to be out in that way. And so these are two short poems that I'm quite fond of, and I'll read them in Hebrew and English. So the first one is called She'at Hashir Hamet. השיר הזה הוא כתובת על מצבה, שמתחתיה קבור השיר הזה. The Hour of the Dead poem. This poem is an epitaph on a tombstone, and beneath it, this poem is buried. Then the next poem. Let's see, is it up there? There it is. This one's untitled. בין דפי הספר מצאתי רגל יבשה של מקק, רגל המתחילה להידמות לאות בשפה חדשה, שלא קיימת בה המילה אהבה. Between the pages of the book, I found the dry leg of a cockroach, a leg that begins to resemble the letter of a new language that has no word for love. And I will conclude my sort of abbreviated journey through my translation history.
We already have one question following. Ooh. That was a wonderful journey. And I have a lot of questions to ask you, but we have one member of the audience who wants to know how you learned Hebrew with the Israeli accents. Is it unique when it's not your native language? So I can say that a lot. It's very unique, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to know sort of accent I have when I speak Hebrew.
Slightly Spanish, not English.
Slightly. No, I think, when I moved to Israel, I guess it was 98, I had just graduated. And a lot of my life until then had been really, it was immersed in Spanish. Also, I just lived in Chile for a year. And so I think that really influenced the way I was speaking Hebrew. And then I had a roommate who was from Argentina. I think, because, I was surrounded by this language that I wanted to know, but that I didn't know very well in the beginning. And so, of course, when I needed to sort of be in a comfort zone linguistically, I would have friends, of course, who spoke English, but I actually really enjoyed speaking Spanish. And one of my roommates was from Argentina. And I think also her Hebrew was very much inflected by her Spanish. And so I kind of think that that was sort of my influence when I was learning how to speak Hebrew in Israel. And it sort of has stuck a bit. Yeah.
It's definitely closer, in terms of the intonation, it's closer to Hebrew than English. Right?
Yeah. It's also easier for me because there are definitely combinations of consonants and sounds that I really struggle with even now with Hebrew. But if I can think of it sometimes like a word in Spanish, I can actually make it come out a little more fluidly. So it's still something that I do when I'm speaking Hebrew. If I get myself a little stuck, I'll just envision it like a word in Spanish. And somehow it just comes out of my mouth. So, it helps. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because you gave us a brief overview, and you've translated other writers as well.
Yeah. This is
just a little bit about how you select who you're going to translate and what excites you about these writers. And I noticed, that you do translate more women than men, maybe. And is that the case? And if so, why?
Yeah. I think in general, well, I do think, when I, especially that senior year, when I knew I was moving to Israel and I was doing a lot of reading of Israeli literature in English translation, Hebrew literature in English translation, I did notice that there were a lot of men. It was like this was also the years of Grossman and Aleph Ben Yoshua, and so and Amos Oz, of course. So it was like, I think I just felt like men were widely represented in translation. And so I think for me, I've always just been drawn to translating. Mostly my guiding impulse is often just what I fall in love with. But also it's trying to think like, what do I think is missing? What do I want? I want people to be surprised a bit. I don't want to just translate what's familiar to everyone or that fits some preconceived notion of what Hebrew literature is or what Israeli literature is. Like, I definitely want to give readers something they may not be expecting.
Like someone like the Vietnamese Israeli poet Vaan Nguyen, I actually got to know through your translations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
wow.
So I'm just saying you're exposing Israelis as well who live abroad, let's say, to some of the stuff that's happening, because you're very much in tune with what's going on right now in Israel.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting.
Right. I think that's really, that's been something that I've also been fascinated by, that what Israelis think should be translated and then versus what I'm actually translating. So a writer like Vaan Nguyen, it's interesting to me because when I read her work, I was immediately pulled into her poetry. I wanted to learn from it. And it really has been a kind of workshop for me, translating that whole book, just learning what poetry can do, and then of course what Hebrew can do. But I remember when I would tell people that I was translating her, and they're like, well, why don't you, they would be like, well, there are these other poets you should be translating, like, there's more Dalia Rabikovich to translate or more Yehuda Amichai. And I was like, but I think, that's what people would expect. But here's a poet who's doing something different. And she's not really part of the Israeli mainstream to the extent that there is a mainstream in Israeli poetry, but she really isn't, that's not where I would locate her. And so I think that it is interesting how sometimes through translation, readers of the original language are also surprised. They also learn something new, not just with what I translate. I think in general, that's what happens when things are translated. It comes back.
Yeah, completely. And you have a part in shaping that. So there's a question that I want from Emily and that I want to also tack on a suggestion to. And the question is, what are the words in Hebrew that are the hardest to translate in English? Are there specific words? And how do you handle them? And I was thinking of Arva, for example, in the poem, in the Vaan Nguyen poem, which is, which crotch just doesn't capture. It's such a loaded term. Yeah. Are there other Hebrew words that you find really difficult to translate?
It's hard off the top of my head. I mean, I think sometimes it's like really, for instance, in the Hezy Leskly poem, which I'm just looking, it's on my screen so I can see, the line, the regel habantchila lehidamot, a leg that begins to, and then you have lehidamot. Okay, it seems fairly straightforward, and then suddenly when you're translating, it doesn't. It's like, it's to resemble, it can also be to be like something, to be fashioned into the likeness of something. Like, they're just all these things that when you translate, sometimes very ordinary words suddenly become really tricky and thorny words. That's the moment when you realize that actually there's a lot that one word is holding inside of itself. And the moment you translate, a lot of stuff starts spilling out, and you have to sort of figure out like how much you want to keep. If sometimes going in one direction takes you somewhere else entirely. And so it's, for me, it's not really that I don't subscribe to the idea that there's anything that's untranslatable. I think you can translate anything. I may not be able to get there, but some other translator may be able to get there. I think more it's a question when I'm translating of what parts of a word I'm able to hold on to. And that's always the hardest thing. And with Hebrew, it's complicated, as you know, the example you gave, just that sometimes these words really come with a lot of historical linguistic baggage. And then you have to figure out, well, you know, how do I convey that in the English? But I always think that there are ways you can. It's not always straightforward, but you can come to some solution.
I'm wondering, like, apropos, we're tackling you with the hardest parts of translation. What for you are the biggest challenges when you approach a translation? You can share some of the process.
I think sometimes the hardest part for me, for me, the hardest part, but also the most satisfying part is the editing stage. Because I think a lot of times that's where it's like those little tinkering things that you're doing, like adding a comma or taking out a comma or changing like to as. Like, it seemed that's actually where things can come together, or they can really fall apart. So I find that sometimes producing the draft is actually really not a problem. It's, you know, actually that part comes very easily. It's that next stage where you have to take all this raw material of language and you have to start deciding like what you're going to keep. And then I will spend a lot of time agonizing over punctuation, or should I start the line with a capital letter or not? And I mean, the book, the Vaan Nguyen book, it's at the printers. I can't change anything now. But I looked at the PDF right before we gave this talk, and I was already like, I was like, oh no, I should have done this thing, because, you know, but at some point you have to let it go. But I think that for me as a literary translator is the hardest part. It's that final editing stage.
There's stories about the Hebrew writer Shai Agnon, who used to he used to sit in the printing shop. You know, the famous thing about him is that every reprinting of his work, he changed the text, and he would actually sit in the printing shop and supervise and keep changing and keep supervising, keep changing. So we can't do that anymore. So a viewer is asking, when you translate living poets like you've done, do they get involved in your process? How much dialogue do you have with them? How close are you to them?
It varies. I think with Vaan, I did a lot of that on my own, partly because I do like to, one of my favorite stages in translation is when no one knows what I'm translating. And so it's all done in secret. It's very private. It's just me and the poems. But at some point, if you want to actually publish translations, you need permission. I had a good stack of translations from Vaan's book, and I wanted to apply for this Penheim translation grant, at which point I had to reveal to her that I was translating her work and ask for permission. And with Vaan, she mostly was fine with she didn't really want to be super involved with the actual translating of things. So she was happy to sit down with me. A couple of times I went to Israel and we sat down with a manuscript, and I had just asked her questions. But she's not the kind of poet who's going to be telling you like, well, this doesn't sound right, or, you know, it's like there's not that kind of interference. It's more like she just was happy to answer the questions and then let me make decisions. I'm translating now a poet, Tahel Frosh. And with Tahel, there's definitely a lot more dialogue over the translations. It's a book called Avarice. And there's a lot of theory of capitalism, neoliberalism. It's a book about the relationship between poetry and money, the role of money in Israeli lives. And Tahel has done so much work on this topic. She wrote an entire thesis for her psychology degree where she interviewed Israeli tycoons. And so I just thought, you know, I have a lot I can learn from her because these are not things that I know a great deal about. So with her, we've sat together and kind of gone through things, and I've sometimes line by line, mostly just to make sure that I'm getting kind of that theory right, because she incorporates it, you know, Marxism and all this stuff. So I think it's really useful to be able to work together. So it really just depends on the project and on the poet. Some poets want to be involved, others don't. And when they want to be involved, it's mostly just about setting kind of expectations, like, you know, this is the kind of feedback I need at this stage as a translator, and, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay. So I think maybe now we can go back a little bit and talk about your book. Mm-hmm. And of course, we welcome any other questions about these poets that you've heard about, or the translations that Adriana just read. But, you know, I love how you have a short preface about your translations in the book, and you write that your mode of translating is creative, bold, and sometimes mischievous. So first I wanted to ask you what you meant by a mischievous translation. Do you mean that you veer far from the original text? And then also the second part of the question is, how do you negotiate your scholarly trajectory and your work as a poet translator? Are those different modes of translating because this book, Strange Cocktails, full of your own translations, mm-hmm. whenever there weren't any existing mm-hmm. in the Hebrew? Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think Mischief, I was thinking more about like what people expect from translation in academic books. I mean, I think I read a lot of academic books that include translations, and a lot of times translations by the author of the book. And you often see, you know, they'll say things like, well, and here's my very literal translation. And I think when I started the project, that was sort of my approach. I felt like, okay, well, I need to be, you know, well-behaved and make sure that the translation is sticking very close to the Hebrew, and make sure, you know, there's very little deviating from literal meaning. And at a certain point, I think because I was doing all this other translating on the side, this felt so deeply unsatisfying to me. I just felt like, you know, I was drawn to the poets that I wrote about in Strange Cocktail, not just because they, you know, reading their work was, you know, set me on these, you know, intellectual inquiries, but also because I really do love their poetry. I mean, it's hard for me to write about things that I don't care about and I don't love. And so I felt like the translations just weren't reflecting that. And I also thought that they themselves, like for instance, in the case of Leah Goldberg, they took their translation practice so seriously. And for them, it was very much for all the poets, you know, and that was the case in my book, is that it was very much a creative practice. And so I think by the time I was ready to go from the dissertation to the book, I was like, I'm going to approach my own translations in this book very differently. And so there were definitely poems that I felt like I needed to sort of have that kind of disclaimer at the beginning, because I knew that someone who knows Hebrew might look at the English and say, well, that's not exactly what's going on, or you've shifted this around. And I think that's where I think the idea of mischief. I mean, for me, mischief isn't a negative thing in this sense. I think it comes with, you know, sometimes just giving things like being sort of playful, or giving yourself permission to sort of go in a direction that might be pushing literal meaning a bit, in the way that the poets I was writing about approached translation. So I think that was the impetus, both for the kinds of translations I was doing, but also then I thought, well, I should write a note about this to explain the different kinds of translations people are going to encounter in the book. So
I mean, that's part of the pleasure of reading this book, is that in addition to the scholarship, we get to read these beautiful translations, which is, as you said, a lot of scholarly translation tends to be very literal and very exacting in that way.
Yeah.
And not capture something of the poetics, right? Of
Right.
Translators. But Naomi wants to know whether you translate any prose, and why are you so fixated on poetry?
Oh gosh,
that's my word. Why are you fixated? Because I love poetry and prose personally.
Yeah. I do like prose. I'm not anti-prose. I think I just really love poetry. So that's, and there are only so many hours in the day. Yeah, exactly. So there are only so many hours in the day, and I'm always going to pick up a book of poetry over anything else. But no, so I did try translating some prose. And I do love reading novels. I've taught novels. I have no problems with the novel or the short story. But yeah, my forays into prose always were so uncomfortable. I really struggled with it. And it's hard to sort of explain why. I think for me, maybe it comes back with being a bit of a late bloomer when it comes to Hebrew, and this sort of practice that I fell into with my Hebrew teacher in college of like going word by word. That I think for me, I get very overwhelmed with prose because I'm someone who gets really fixated on a word and what it's doing and where this word came from. And suddenly to have to do that with, say, a poem of a few pages is one thing. When you're facing a 3,000 word story, it's another. And then, of course, you also, when you're translating prose, you have to be attentive to like a narrative arc, to character development. There are just all these other elements that, frankly, I don't think I'm not able to pull it off so well because I think I get stuck in the minutia. And so I actually translated a couple of stories by a writer named Gail Hareven. I did these in like 2008. And recently, one of them finally got placed. She has the stories, and so it was I wasn't really involved in finding a publisher for them. But I was told, this journal 2 Lines picked up the story that you translated. And I was like, oh, that's right. I did this translation of a story once. But I agreed to kind of look it over and see if it needed any revising. And I was kind of surprised. I felt almost like I was reading someone else's translation. I could see myself in it, but I think I've changed a great deal since then, and haven't really, in the decades since, haven't gone back to prose at all. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. It's not.
Yes, that's definitely helpful. Maybe you'll change also.
Maybe.
But yes, you definitely have charted your path in the field of poetic translation. And another question from Noemi is, have you translated these poems to Spanish? Meaning the same Hebrew poems, I guess. Did you ever consider translating them into your other language?
No, I don't even. I've never done that, and I don't think I could at this point. I mean, at a certain point, I think Hebrew really took over my life in a really sort of profound way. And I still use Spanish daily. It's still the language in which I speak to my mother. I still have a lot of family and friends with whom I use Spanish. I actually love reading novels in Spanish, strangely. So that is one place where I'll read a lot of prose in Spanish. But no, I haven't done that kind of translation. And I actually went back to Chile before the pandemic. I was there for 2 weeks, and I presented some of my translations of Tahel Frosh. And there was actually a person at this research institute that I was attending who translated them into Spanish. And that was a really interesting process to see these poems in Spanish. She worked off of my English translation, And I was, I gave her some feedback, but it still felt like a movement that I couldn't do at this point. I think because it even happens to me when I'm speaking Spanish. Sometimes I'll think of the Hebrew word first. It's a very strange thing, the way language begins to occupy a certain part of your brain. And
since you discussed your infatuation with Hebrew, can we dig a little deeper into that?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, how does, a person who obviously did not come to Hebrew in any straightforward, like, Jewish day school path or heritage kind of journey or whatever it is, or even, it wasn't even a literary infatuation from the very start, but still you have a very strong relationship, but it's also one of someone who is doesn't always feel at home in Hebrew, is kind of always has this vantage point, which is also an advantage point of a foreigner, right? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I still remember when I came home after living in Santiago, and I told my mother, I said, I think I'm going to study Hebrew. And she was like, what? She had been getting my letters where I was talking about, like, the Israelis I was meeting. And I was telling her about, I had found a collection of Rachel's poetry in Spanish, and I was reading that. But I think she thought, it was a passing phase, and I would move on to other things. And then I did start studying it, and then went to Israel. And it was just like, I think, at some point, I think she and other family members and friends realized, oh, this isn't a fad anymore. Like, she's really serious about this. But yeah, I think what drew me to Hebrew and what keeps drawing me to Hebrew is that, when I was in college, I was doing something that was very much within my comfort zone. I mean, I got there and I spoke fluent Spanish. I could write in Spanish. And so that part of it wasn't a challenge for me. And I think by the end of it, I was starting to have this sort of feeling that it was, I was in my comfort zone, and I wasn't happy being there. It was almost like I could see everything mapped out. And I wanted to be surprised a bit. Maybe this is something that I think I'm someone who likes to always be learning and always feel like I'm being pushed. And I think for me, Hebrew presented an opportunity in a very radical way to get out of my comfort zones. But once I was there in the language, it really felt like I was at home in a strange way. I felt like this is where I'm supposed to be. Like, I felt like even though I didn't know what something meant, I was confident that I would one day figure out what something meant. And the literature is the same thing for me. It was, I think for me, being an outsider is actually part of the adventure of it for me. I don't find it, I'm not scared by it or intimidated by it. I think actually I find it energizes me. I think that, when I was working on Latin American poetry, it was too straightforward. And as you know from my introduction to Strange Cocktail, I don't like straightforward things. So that was part of it, I think. Yeah.
I also want to know, so we talked a little bit about your past and how you got in your journey, and maybe let's talk about the present and what you're working on now. Specifically, for all of our viewers and for us at the Frankel Center, this year has been the strangest of all. Speaking of strange cocktails, I hope you had a lot of cocktails during this strange year. But how did that affect your work, and what are you focusing now in your translation or your and what maybe opportunities opened up? Like, you and I have attended a lot of poetry readings on Zoom together. So.
Yeah, I think I've had to sort of simplify the project. I think I wanted to do this, picking up a strand from Strange Cocktail. I'm really interested in this idea of translation as the afterlife of a text, and how maybe Hebrew poets have actually engaged with that specific idea that translation is how something lives on. And I had this very ambitious plan to include lots of poets in that study, but because of the pandemic and being away from my own personal library and not having access to a lot of books, I was like, well, I have Hezy Leskly's collected poems. So I'm just going to really kind of hone it and focus on his work. And it's been wonderful. I feel like in so many ways I've returned to sort of the basics, which is, you know, reading a poem, spending a lot of time thinking about what it's doing, and also translating. So I've been translating his work and really opening that project up. I think I've translated a lot of his poems over the years, and I've thought about sort of trying to put a book together. But I think this year, especially having to sort of readjust my research expectations, that project has come into a much clearer focus. So now that I have Vaan Nguyen, that translation is at the printers, I'm excited to sort of dig into Leskly's poetry a little more. So that's what my present project is.
I know that in the book you wrote a lot about poets who are translators.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see Hezy Leskly as one of those, or in what way does translation, is it a part of his own practice of writing?
So Hezy Leskly he grew up in Givatayim, which is part of the Tel Aviv municipality. And then he moved to the Netherlands in the 1970s, and he studied visual arts there. And he has this really intriguing series of poems, and it's called Translations of Dutch Poets Who Never Existed. And so he creates these poets, these Dutch poets, and translates them, as it were. But he's very open about the fact that these are not real poets. And throughout his poetry, in a number of his poems, he'll refer to poets who don't exist, but who exist in his poems in his Hebrew. And I'm really fascinated by this, like the creation of poets and this kind of fiction of the imaginary translated poet that he brings into his work, and thinking about like why is he doing this? Can we take these poems that he quotes that never existed and imagine, that they once were a full poem of some kind? Like sometimes I put myself in the headspace of like someone who comes across these poems maybe in fragments in 500 years, and maybe it's actually thinks, oh, this is a quote from a poem that may have existed once, except we know it's fake, but 500 years from now, someone may not know that. And I find that just really, that possibility is really interesting to me. And what's motivating a poet to start kind of creating poets and poems that never existed, except they do exist in his head, right? So that's a part of it.
Like he's conjuring up ghosts, but the ghosts are not connected to any living.
They're not, no. But someone might need a whole story for these poets who never existed, and that's how they'll live on. So that's something that I find really interesting about his work. There's a sort of playfulness to this, but I think it's also really quite serious. It's grounded in very serious concerns. I think he was living at a time that, I'm not sure the word AIDS was fully out there, but his friends were getting sick and they were dying. And then by the time he contracted HIV, AIDS was a full-blown crisis. And so I think there's something there. I'm also really learning a lot through his work about that period of time, and the kind of poetry that was coming out of the AIDS crisis is something that I'm also exploring.
Well, thank you so much. I think you gave us a lot of what you're doing, where you're going now, and I really look forward to reading more of your translations. You write beautiful prose about them as well. And we put the links in the chat, I think, for your book.
Mm-hmm.
And good luck with the forthcoming book that you can't alter anymore.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was wonderful to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you to our guests and to all of you who joined us this evening for such an interesting, wonderful presentation. Please visit us at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org. And we'll hopefully see you soon. Good night.